everyone, Clio here, and today I'm talking about my favorite translated works of literature. Now let me clarify from the beginning that I'm going to be talking about books that are not originally written in the English language. However, I've read many of these in their original language, so it's just basically because I do my videos in English, I reach out to an international public, but probably a lot of you guys will be English speakers, will be reading a lot in English, and so I just wanted to put the attention out there to a couple of works that aren't originally written in English. One of these actually isn't even written in English, but I couldn't keep that book out of this list. This video is inspired by a video that Kate recently did on the same subject, and so I'll link her video down below. And part of my Japanese list is actually reduced, and go and check out her selection so that you can have some other Japanese lit recommendation, because I just have too many Japanese books that I love, and so it was so painful to narrow it down, but there are a couple of them that I left out that Kate has in her list. So without further ado, let's dive into it. I don't know what structure I'm going to be using here, but so I guess I'm going to go in the way that she went, and I'm going to do this by continent. So let's start in Latin America, in South America, and let's start with Gabriel García Márquez and with 100 Years of Solitude. So this is already a first example of, like, I read this book in Spanish, so I cannot speak to its translated edition, but I'm going to assume that in translation it holds up just as well. So this is a multi-generational story set within the fictional world that Gabriel García Márquez created, which is called Macondo. So it is multi-generational. We'll be looking at these people and their lives, but it is very much magical realism, so it definitely feels a lot more like just a regular multi-generational tale, but from time to time it has these sort of supernatural elements to it. It has a little bit of the mysterious within it. I will say difficult about this book is the fact that a lot of the names look alike. You might want to have a character list to help you out, because, for example, one of the characters, you start out with a character called Aureliano Buendia, and I think Aureliano is like a name that a lot of them get, and then you have José Arcadio, so you will have like combinations of José and Aurelio. You will have an Aurelio in itself, which is like another generation, so names definitely do become a problem at some point. But I absolutely love this story. Cannot really say why I absolutely loved it. I just love magical realism and the sort of atmosphere surrounding magical realism as a whole, and I like multi-generational stories, so I'm definitely due for a reread of this, and I definitely know that there is a possibility for you not to like it. I read this in a book club, and I was the only person who even liked this book. You know, I love this book, but none of the other people actually really like this. So yeah. Second and final book that I want to mention for Latin and Central America is Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel, which is a Mexican novel. I absolutely love this book, and I actually want a physical copy of it as well. So this is also magical realism, and it is centered around these women living in the countryside in Mexico, in a secluded place in Mexico, but it's all about the interrelation of food and life. So the story is told kind of through the making of certain dishes and through the recipes needed to make these dishes, but these recipes sort of become like recipes for life as well, and they're always linked to certain events within the story, to certain events within the lives of the people making this food. It will make you crave Mexican food, it will make you crave this sort of atmosphere, make you want to cook, and it's very much a book that evokes the passion for cooking. And so yeah, it's absolutely a book that I fell in love with. Definitely want to read more by her and figure out whether it's just that book or whether I absolutely love this author's writing style. That's going to be it for Latin America. I sadly haven't read too much books by Latin American authors, so I definitely need to make a change to that. I have read some others that were originally published in English that I'm definitely not including, and some others that just didn't blow me away and so don't make it onto this list. But I definitely want to find more of those, so if you have recommendations for great authors from Latin America that I need to explore, definitely let me know down below. But let's move on to another continent, and let's move to Europe, I guess. So next up for Europe we will be talking about The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. This is a French classic. I am currently in the middle of a buddy read for The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, and I think Alexandre Dumas is a great author if you want to go for a more accessible classic. So this is classical literature. I think it's from like 18th, 19th century, probably 19th century. And it is very much, he's a writer of adventure stories. So The Three Musketeers, it is a well-known story. So we are looking at these three musketeers who are part of the guard for the king. And it's all about the sort of like the honor of musketeers. I have forgotten almost everything specific about what takes place within this book, but I know that after I read it I was super pleasantly surprised, because I didn't go in with very high expectations, because I was just expecting, you know, a sort of adventure story, and then a sort of adventure story that is outdated at this point in time. But Alexandre Dumas' writing for me definitely doesn't date. It's very accessible at this point in time as well, and it is very much still fun, still very much engaging, and I have that same experience now with The Count of Monte Cristo. It's just amazing literature. You need to give Alexandre Dumas a try. Another French classic that I'm going to be recommending is The Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo. Notre-Dame, I don't know why I say it so English. But so yeah, this is another one that we all know the story because of Disney, but it is also a great book. I think Victor Hugo, a little bit less accessible maybe than Alexandre Dumas, but definitely also still very accessible writing style. It is a little bit less accessible I say, because he does have a little bit more of a tendency to have these long descriptive passages in it, which you wouldn't find in that type of story these days. However, I absolutely love those passages. I absolutely love the description of Paris, the description of the cathedral, for example, the love for the cathedral that came out of that. And I remember absolutely being surprised by this one, because The Hunchback of Notre-Dame is not really a Disney movie that I actually like. It's one that I tolerate and that I can sit through and be like, well, yeah, it's nice. But it's never been one of my favorites. But I did definitely vibe a whole lot with this book. And I do have Les Miserables on my shelf, and which is probably going to be my project for next year. My big book for next year, because that's a huge chunker. The Hunchback of Notre-Dame is not a light book. I mean, it's not a small book. I think it's also on the heavier side, as also is the case with The Three Musketeers, but it definitely is worth it. Don't be discouraged, just try it out. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you, but I do feel like these are two relatively accessible classical authors. Moving on to Italy. So for Italy I have a book here that is If on a Winter's Night, The Traveller by Italo Calvino. Italo Calvino, very interesting writer. He's very much a modernist writer, and so this is going to be hit or miss depending on whether you like that style or not. It's very much going to be a meta level book. It's very much not really a book. It doesn't have a story, it doesn't have very much of a plot line to it. It is a collection of first chapters, more or less. We start out by trying to tell this story, and after like each chapter the story will change and we'll get something totally different, but throughout we are also getting addressed as the reader, and we have these elements of talking about the novel and talking about the role of author and readers, something that I absolutely adore reading in literature, but obviously it is going to be something that is easy to hate on. I'm very aware that this is not conventional literature, and so that a lot of you might not like this at all. So if you dive into this and you find yourself being very frustrated with it early on, just DNF it, it's not going to be for you. And that's a tip for myself as well, because I read another book by him, Invisible Cities, and I didn't like it. I powered through just because I love If on a Winter's Night a Traveler so much that I felt like, well, I have to love this, you know. I love this other book so much, how could I not love this one? But no, this other book definitely wasn't for me, so just bow out if you find yourself not enjoying yourself. Another European one, so I have two more European ones here, which are books which are Belgian books, so from my own home country, and I will first mention the one which is not available in English. So sadly, if you don't know any other languages, you're not going to be able to read this. This one has been translated in Spanish, I think, in French and in Turkish, I believe, and that is It Melts, I'm going to say, Het Smelt by Lize. This is very much a book for me. This is written by a Flemish girl born in the same year as I am, and so it touches a lot of things that there was just so much nostalgia involved within this book, but it's like, it's not a nostalgic read, it's very much a dark read. We're very much looking at sort of, this character is going back for a high school reunion, but she's looking back at sort of the joys of her youth, but also the troubled times that she had while she was young. And definitely those troubled times are not relatable to me. There's definitely some controversial stuff that happened in her past. And so she's also very much from a small town within Flanders, and I'm definitely from a big city. So in that sense there was also not a nostalgia there, but I definitely did, in my mind, center all of this within like a small town where my grandmother was from. But it's just a really good story. It's told in an interesting way. It has this sort of element of mystery to it the entire time, because she's traveling with a block of ice and you don't know why, and it's just amazing. It's special. I know that in Flanders, so within Flanders, the region of Belgium where I'm from, this became a big like bestseller, but I know that a whole lot of people who read it hated this book. So this is another one of those Marmite books that you either love or hate. If you know how to read Dutch, Spanish, French or Turkish, I would say find this book and try it out for yourself. Second one is one that is available in English, and I actually don't know the title in English. I am assuming The Late Comer by Dimitri Verhulst. So it's in Dutch, it's called The Latecomer, which you can literally translate more or less the same. English and Dutch are very similar from time to time. So The Late Comer is a sort of very short comic story told by Dimitri Verhulst, in which this guy pretends to have dementia because he's sick and tired of living with his wife in the house. So it's quite comic, but it's very comic in the sense of how far he's going, you know. Like he has to go all the way just in order to convince people that he's actually demented. But he also takes great pleasure in going all the way and in allowing a lot of things such as bodily functions to just flow and be free. Another piece of European literature is from Portugal, and that is Blindness by José Saramago. This is a piece of dystopian literature in which people start to go blind. So it starts off with our protagonist who comes home and all of a sudden he doesn't see anymore, and so he's picked up by the authorities the next morning to be taken into isolation. His wife then pretends to be blind as well in order for her to go into this institution with him. And so we kind of get the perspective from his wife, being the only person who can see within this institution, seeing how things develop within that structure. So it's very much going to be looking at power dynamics within the society, because the people from the outside world are too scared to come into this facility, fearing that this disease is a contagion, fearing that they will also go blind if they come into contact with these people. And so they very much leave them up to their own. But very early on, one of the groups within the institution will take control, will start to claim the food packages and redistribute them according to their needs. And they are actually led by a person who was already blind before going into isolation, before being forced into isolation. So it's a very interesting book, and later on there are some other developments that will take us out of the institution again, which will also show us a very changed and interesting world. But so yeah, I've always loved this book. I read it in high school. It's one of the success stories of like required reading when I was in high school. But yeah, I definitely also want to do a reread for it at some point. And it's a book that will stay with me forever. I will always think about some of the things that were mentioned in there. It is a little bit of a hard book as well. There are definitely things taking place there. It's very much looking at a lawless society and the corruption and the extravagancies and the atrocious things that people are capable of when they are given, when there's no longer this sort of governing body to control them. And then the final piece of European literature is a shift into Asia, and that will be Russian literature. The one that I'm going to be mentioning is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. So I also read Anna Karenina, which I also liked, but I didn't love. But this one is my new classical baby. I love this one so much. So within this one, we are following members of the aristocracy in Russia. We are following both male characters as female characters, and we are following them at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, meaning that we are going in and out of war periods, meaning that we're also going to have periods in which we have some of our male characters who are at the front, while the female characters are anxiously awaiting their return home, and then periods of peace where they are reunited. There are very much some like love relationships going on within this book, some love relationships that you are rooting for. It's very much looking obviously at warfare. Tolstoy talks a lot about the way in which war is written and how the reality of war is very different from the sort of glorification of war within literature. But it's also talking about how history is written from the perspective of the winners, and how the way in which like war is typically described very much is described from a point of hindsight, of knowing, you know, this is what the consequence was of that, and so describing actions as strategies rather as it just being reflex actions taken in a moment in order to be able to survive. Absolutely love this book. It also goes into matters of socialism. So one of the characters within this book, for example, very much is more concerned with, you know, the fate of his of the farmers that are under his responsibility, and trying to improve their circumstances, improve their situation. At the same time, he is also one of those characters who has been looked down upon quite heavily by the aristocracy, because he's basically a bastard son who gets recognized at the beginning of this novel and who inherits a huge fortune, which the other members of the aristocracy don't believe he is entitled to. It's a big boy. It's definitely daunting to dive into, but I would say I read this in a month, and I read some other books that month as well, so if you get into the cadence of this book, it can definitely fly by very quickly. And as I said, it's one of my favorite novels now. I want to reread it at some point. It's just so chunky that I cannot do it immediately. I definitely want to finish some of the other big badass classics on my shelves before I dive into a reread of this one, but I definitely will at some point. Next up, let's dive fully into Asia. So I'm mainly going to be talking about Japanese literature, but I definitely want to dive more into Chinese literature. I've definitely read a few already, and some like by Chinese authors within America who write in English as their first language, but I definitely want to write into more Chinese literature by Chinese authors in Chinese. Not that I will be reading it in Chinese, but a book that really sparked my interest in China, that really was responsible for me learning Chinese, was Wild Swans by Zhou Chang. This is a non-fiction, but it definitely reads as a novel, and it's a multi-generational story about her family basically during, so it starts from her grandmother's time period, her mother, and then her own time period, meaning that we get like pre-communist China, we get the rise of Mao, and then like student revolutions and all of those things happening within this book. I thought it was just super powerful book to read. I definitely want to reread that one as well, because it's also one that I read in high school. It just had a huge impact on me at the time, and that I still remember snippets about. I definitely remember, you know, the impact of reading about foot binding, for example, but I would definitely want to reread it. And then let us dive into Japanese literature. So as I said at the very beginning of this video, I am not going to be giving you all of the Japanese literature that I love, because I love quite a bit of it, and I obviously also love quite a bit of books by the same authors, but so I only wanted to do one book by one author in any case, but I still ended up with like 6 books or something that I wanted to talk about, which I then narrowed down to 3. But as I said, also check out Kay's videos for some other recommendations, and I'm also definitely also still looking out for a lot more. There's just so much Japanese literature out there, and almost all of it that I've tried out has been amazing. So let me first start off with the first one, which I'm now starting to doubt whether it is actually Japanese. Yeah, translated from the Japanese, I'm safe here. And that is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. She has a new book coming out this year, Earthlings, which I have an arc for, which I will be reading this month. But so Convenience Store Woman is a story about a woman in, like, I'm going to assume her 30s, late 20s maybe, and she is working in a convenience store. And so everybody was fine with her working there when she was like younger, when she was a student, and it was still acceptable, but it's starting to she's starting to get more and more questions about like, why are you still working in that job? Don't you want to change jobs? Why are you still single? And about why she isn't conforming to the standard vision of what a woman should be, what a woman should do in Japanese society. Let's just face it, in society as a whole. Very much love this one. She is very much more of an odd one out character, you know. She has difficulties understanding human behaviors, or understanding, you know, social conventions and things like that. So she is very much somebody who kind of needs a people's manual, and who created one for herself. And so that is also why the convenience store suits her. You know, the rules of the convenience stores are rules that she has internalized, that she has fully grasped. And, you know, she's just very much concerned with the convenience store and making the convenience store run as smoothly as possible. And it's very much going to be looking at why society doesn't just allow her to be that, why society has this need to push her onwards and upwards, why it couldn't just be enough that she absolutely adores working in the convenience store, why it cannot be enough that she likes her life, is comfortable with the life that she is leading already at that point. Love this one, hoping that Earthlings will be as big of a success for me as this one was. Next up we get to The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. So Yoko Ogawa is an author I recently discovered. I do definitely want to read more by her. Her most recent novel, The Memory Police, was, for example, nominated for the International Booker Prize, and definitely has been doing the rounds. But so The Housekeeper and the Professor is a beautiful tale about a professor who has a limited memory. So he only has a memory of 80 minutes. So after 80 minutes, you know, the first minute will get erased and be replaced with a new minute, you know. So he always has this sort of constantly refreshing pool of 80 minutes. And so he has to have these sort of notes on hand that help him remind him of certain things. And he's been going through housekeepers, but when our protagonist, the housekeeper, goes into his employ, things match up, and there's this beautiful friendship that originates between these two characters through the love of mathematics, because this professor is this huge professor in mathematics who, because of his condition, can no longer exercise his profession, but he shares a lot of his knowledge about mathematics with his housekeeper. And really, I was so intrigued by all of the mathematics. I did do maths as a, let's call it a major, within high school, so I do have some a little bit more of an interest in mathematics maybe than others, but I wouldn't call myself a mathematics fanatic or something like that. And I still absolutely loved, you know, the explorations of mathematics, but also the explorations of like life wisdom through mathematics. So it's just a beautiful friendship, it's a beautiful story, and I would highly recommend that you all try it out at some points. And then the final one that I'm going to mention, I couldn't mention Japanese literature without mentioning this author, of course, and that is Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage by Haruki Murakami. And never in a million years would I have thought that this was going to be the one Murakami that I would recommend to people, because this is a book that I don't hear talk about very often. But I finally read it last year and I fell in love. So Murakami is mostly known for his sort of weird literature, and I absolutely love his weird literature, and up until this point, 1Q84 was my favorite book by him and one of my favorite books of all times. But when I read Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki, I fell in love with his other type of prose. So this is very much more realistic fiction. It doesn't have any of the weirdness. There's this one weird scene, but it happens in a dream, which also happens in his weird stuff. But you know, in this one I definitely can imagine it just having been a dream in this case, whereas in his other works, dreams are often like, there's often very much unclear whether a dream is really a dream or whether there's this mix with reality. But so this is very much more realistic, and we're going to be looking at Tsukuru Tazaki, who when he was a child, he was part of this very tight friend group, a friend group of 5. And he was the one who didn't have a color in his name. So all of his other friends had a last name that had a color in them, and he always felt himself to be the odd one out. Not just in terms of the fact that they had colors in their names, but he always felt like they were very colorful people and he didn't have a color. He was just bland, and if anybody was going to fall out of this group, it was going to be him. And then sadly that also happened, because at some point when he was off in university and when he came back like for a semester break, his friends didn't want to see him anymore, told him that he should know why they were cutting him out, and just banned him from their lives. Tsukuru Tazaki, being the insecure, silent, introverted character that he is, he also didn't question this at all. He just kind of assumed that what he had always suspected was going to happen had finally happened, and so he never questioned this. But now, many years later, he's starting to date a woman, and he tells her this story, and she tells him, you need to go back, you need to find out why these friends abandoned you like that, you need to find out what happened. It was gorgeous. I related so much to the character of Tsukuru Tazaki. You know, all of these insecure feelings that you definitely have that I definitely had very strongly when I was just a child, when I was in my puberty. They were just very much beautifully rendered within this story, and it just hit all of the notes right for me. As with a lot of Murakami's works, it also talks about music, it talks about whiskey. All of these elements add a sort of atmosphere that I've come to love so much. So I do also still want to continue on with a lot more of his works. I have read quite a substantial amount already, but there's definitely still a lot more of him that I still need to get to. And at this point I have read all of them that I have on my shelf, so it's time for another Murakami book, I think. And maybe it is time for Norwegian Wood, for example, which is also one of his more contemporary style books, rather than one of his weird speculative ones. But so, yeah, that's it for my list of my favorite translated pieces of literature. Definitely let me know down below if you've read any of these books, what your thoughts were on them. And if you have recommendations, definitely let me know them, because I absolutely love exploring new cultures, exploring other ways of living through their literature. And I definitely think that there's such rich voices out there. So yeah, that's definitely something that I want to dive into more. So yeah, let me know whether that's something you're interested in and whether you have recommendations, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!